Our speaker today is Professor Pete Boettke. Professor Boettke is University Professor of Economics and Philosophy at George Mason University, and he is the director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center. The title of his lecture today is Austrian Economics. Professor Boettke.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason, and thank you to all the people out there attending. I wish this was in person so I could talk to all of you and see your reactions, but I'm going to try to give a quick overview of the Austrian School of Economics. It's awful hard to do this in a short period of time, cover a 100-year history. So hopefully I can highlight some of the key points and be able to stimulate you to do some of the readings and think about it if you're not aware of the tradition in the past, or if you are aware of it, to ask some deeper questions of it and pursue it further. So one of the first things to ask is, what's so Austrian about Austrian economics? And in this slide, what I do is I highlight the word Austrian and I highlight the word economics because in discussing the Austrian tradition, it was born at the University of Vienna in the late 19th century. It matured at the University of Vienna during the 1900 to 1930s. But as anyone who knows history, by the 1930s, life in Austria began to become unlivable for intellectuals. And as a result, the tradition starts to migrate. And part of the whole story is about the migration of that. But when you ask a question about Austrian economics, one of the questions you need to ask is, what's Austrian about it rather than location? And then what's the economics? And so I have two images here. One of them is from a wonderful book by Erwin Decker, and it's called The Viennese Students of Civilization. And what Erwin does in that book, he's a professor at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And what Erwin does in that book is he contextualizes the Austrian school within the broader intellectual milieu of Vienna at its time and Central European culture in general at that time. Part of the reason why Erwin, it's so important for Erwin to do that is because of another phenomena that he refers to as left luggage, that when the Austrian tradition migrates out of Viennese context into London, let's say, what was the luggage that was left in the transit, or when it comes to Geneva, or when it comes to the United States? And that's going to be a big question. Austrian economics, on the other hand, is also a very technical set of ideas in economics. And I'll mention some of those. And that's captured over here in a diagram that was involved in the development of understanding the capital structure in economy and the time structure of production. I'll elaborate a little bit more about that in a second. But as you can see, that's economics. There's nothing uniquely cultural about that diagram except for what the science of economics is trying to capture. Whereas in Erwin, note that that's a picture that's involved. Erwin explains this picture in the book. And the notion of students of civilization rather than as directors of civilization or saviors of civilization. The second volume of Keynes's The Trilogy by Skidelsky on Keynes, that's the definitive biography on Keynes. The second volume is called The Economist as Savior, which is exactly how Keynes saw economists as. They were saviors of the civilization that was under collapse. And that's the contrast with the students of civilization, who would never have the position of being a savior. And so that leads to a big difference in the way you think about economics. Okay, so this is a, the one slide here, the picture, the image of that's Menger, Schumpeter, Hayek, and Mises. They are in many ways the four representative examples of the Austrian School of Economics in that Viennese period. There are other classic figures, von Bavarick being the most important of those figures. He was the finance minister as well as a professor, and he was a major theorist in developing economics worldwide. He was recognized as one of the top 5 economists in the world in his time. what were the contributions of this Austrian school to economic science? And what I'm trying to suggest, let me start at the end and then come back. One of the things that's really interesting is that economics was taught at the University of Vienna within a law school. So all of these economists were trained in law and then studying economic relations in relationship to the law. And that is important because they saw these legal institutions as providing the institutional infrastructure within which economic activity takes place. So an idea which I'll come back to later on in modern economics, which is that economics is about exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place, that was from the very beginning part of what the Austrian school was arguing for. But the unique Austrian contribution was Menger was one of the marginal revolutionaries. He's one of the founders of the marginal revolution in economics, which changed the way that we thought about value theory. And he was also a radical subjectivist, that individuals and their perceptions of their reality and their ability and command over resources at their disposal to try to pursue their ends is the beginning of economic analysis to Menger, and he's a subjectivist theory of costs and of value. And this led to the development by one of Menger's associates, Wieser, of the idea of opportunity cost. Opportunity cost reasoning begins with the Austrians. So the first thinkers to articulate that basic idea that dominates all of economic way of thinking is to think in terms of the opportunity costs associated with pursuing one path rather than another. As I said, they were marginalists, so they believed that you didn't look at the whole of a particular unit, the total amount of water in the world or whatever. You looked at the marginal unit of water. So this solved the diamond water paradox. Water is more valuable for human survival, but diamonds were more valuable in the marketplace. Why was that the case? And the argument is that if you think about it, diamonds are relatively more scarce than water. So the next additional unit of water is less valuable than the next additional diamond. Not because in some objective sense, diamonds are more important for human survival than water. In fact, they aren't. But on the margin, when we're choosing, the relative scarcity of one versus the other leads us to value that. And that is used to then examine how prices come about in the market. And so it's extremely, one of the main things that Menger developed was a theory of price formation, not a theory of price determination. So it wasn't in an equilibrium model. Instead, it comes out of the higgling and bargaining of the market and how that price formation process emerges from the exchange activity of individuals. They also applied the marginal analysis to the notion of factor pricing. And this leads to a challenge to the sort of Marxist doctrines of exploitation and of surplus value that became a dominant view within economics again, which is called the marginal productivity theory of wage distribution, or marginal productive theory of factor pricing. And that is that workers are going to get paid the value of their marginal product, and that any of the various different efforts at exploitation or of surplus value are going to actually in the market be competed away through the idea of the exchange relations between them. Now, you could actually invoke at this point the discrepancies of power relations and whatnot. And that, in fact, one of the early Austrians, Friedrich Wieser, has an entire book where he discusses the law of power and examines those kind of issues as well. And that's why Schumpeter and Wieser and some others were also involved in economic sociology. They're the founding of economic sociology. Don't have time to go into that as much as I should. The time element, from Menger onwards, Austrian economists always worried about the time element in economic action. Time only moves in one direction. It's not reversible. So it only goes in one direction. We're always involved in production for an uncertain future. We're trying to figure out ways in which we coordinate our activities through time. And so this led to, for example, focus on intertemporal coordination. If I'm trying to, you know, if there's a huge demand in the market for bacon, I have to raise hogs out on my farm. The hogs have to be maintained, and I have to expend resources, labor, and financial resources on maintaining the hogs in order to do what? To be able to actually deliver the hogs to the market, you know, in 2 years or so, in order for those hogs to become bacon. How is it that I coordinate that activity over time? What would happen if all of a sudden everyone became a vegetarian or a vegan, and therefore the demand for bacon fell way down? What would that do to my organization of my activities on my hog farm? These are all the questions that the Austrians were worried about and paid attention to, and that leads to this notion of this time structure of production. Monetary theory. One of Ludwig von Mises's great innovations was to integrate monetary theory into marginal utility theory. And in doing so, one of the great advances in economics was when people understood the quantity theory of money. It goes all the way back to David Hume as an explanation, coming up to modern economists. And the idea that the quantity of money and prices are correlated with each other, price level and economy are correlated with one another. So you can't fix problems of poverty by just printing more money. All right, that's called the quantity theory of money. What Mises showed was that the quantity theory of money was too mechanical. On the other hand, you have monetary cranks. So the monetary cranks who think you just can print money, they had to be defeated. All right, and so Mises, you know, agrees that the quantity theory is advanced on that. But once we have the quantity theory, then we have to have a more nuanced understanding. And this leads Mises to the idea of the non-natured non-neutrality of money, that money is 1/2 of all exchanges. All right, as a result, if you screw around with money, you're going to screw around with all the exchanges in the economy. And so money cannot ever simply be a veil. Money instead is a loose joint. All right, and so you can't double the money. You can't double the money supply without eventually doubling the price level. But how that price level comes to be doubled is through the relative price adjustments in the economy, which cause disturbances in the system. All right. Now, both this time structure of production and this non-neutrality of money means that I need to have some mechanisms by which I can maintain coordination for production in an uncertain future, investment into an uncertain future. And that led to the Austrians to focus on the role of economic calculation. That is the ability for economic actors to sort through the array of technologically feasible projects, those projects which are economically viable. So you can have many different ways that are technologically feasible, but only a subset of them are going to be economically viable. How do economic actors within the market find that out? And you know what Mises articulates and what Hayek further elaborates is that this is a consequence of having private ownership in the means of production, and the role of the price system in guiding exchange and production behavior, and the role of profits to lure us in our investments, and the role of losses to discipline us. And so when we again have distortions to that property prices and profit and loss system, don't be surprised when malcoordination occurs and we have economic disruptions. Schumpeter to modern Austrian economists have wanted to put a focus on the agent of change. Since the market exists through time and error is part of human decision making, what markets are about is adaptation and adjustment to constantly changing circumstances. The Austrian economists wanted to then focus on the agent that is involved in that adaptation and adjustment process, and that's going to be the market maker, which is the entrepreneur. So rather than ever treating price as a parameter, in the Austrian view of the market, price is always a variable. The economic actors are price makers, not price takers, and that has huge consequences for the way we think about arbitrage as well as the way we think about innovation. And the Austrians, from Schumpeter, starting in his early work, You can see the sort of seeds of it already in Menger, but all developing all the way up to Mises and eventually to Israel Kirzner. Today, the theory of entrepreneurship and the market process has been at the core. And the final thing that I wanted to say is, again, the Austrian school had major contributions to the theory of law and economics. Hayek's book, Law, Legislation, and Liberty, but also Constitutional Liberty, are examinations of the law and the appropriate issue of the rule of law in economic affairs. Public choice economics, constitutional political economy, the kind of questions that are raised by Jim Buchanan are questions which are in fact were raised by Mises and Hayek as well. And so there's a unitedness in all of this. Coase, by the way, just, I'll mention this a little bit. He was a student of Hayek at the London School of Economics. So the connections in all of these things are quite deep. This is Hayek actually teaching at the London School of Economics. He was given a chair at a very young age and became quite a sensation in the early 1930s. Hayek got that job. Lionel Robbins was the department chairman and was very influenced by Mises and was paying attention to Hayek. Mises had very much difficulty in speaking in English at the time. So when the chair came open, rather than Mises, Hayek had spent a year in the United States on a study leave at Columbia and at NYU. And so he had some command of English language. And so that's why he was the natural choice. And so he migrates to the London School of Economics. Joseph Schumpeter before him migrate first to Bonn and then eventually to Harvard. Mises goes to Geneva, then eventually to the National Bureau of Economic Research, and then NYU. And Hayek moves to Chicago and then eventually to Freiburg. Oscar Morgenstern, one of the founders of the application of game theory to economics, he moves to Princeton. Fritz Machlup, who was a close associate of Mises and Hayek's as well. In Vienna, he moves to Johns Hopkins and then eventually to Princeton. Gottfried Habeler moved to Harvard, and another one of Mises's students, Alfred Schutz, the sociologist, he moved to the New School for Social Research in New York City. So in the 1930s and 1940s, all of the leading intellectuals, these young upstart superstars of social science, they leave Vienna and move to Europe and eventually to the United States. Once in the United States in the 1940s and then 1950s, Hayek moves to the United States in the 1950s. Mises begins his career teaching in the mid-1940s. When he first came to the United States, as I mentioned, he worked at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He did that for 4 years, from 1940 to 1944. And then he started teaching at NYU, and he taught at NYU till 1969. Schumpeter had moved earlier in the 1930s to Harvard. Habeler, I think, is in the 40s. Machlup and Morgenstern are in the 30s, moving to the United States. So we get to the students that are being educated in the 1950s by these thinkers, and the two main people being educated are going to be Israel Kirzner and Murray Rothbard. Now, Israel Kirzner is a very focused academic. He's an economic scholar and an economic theorist, and all of his activities are academic, not at all involved in any kind of politics or ideological movement in a broader sense, just sheer economics. So if you think about his books, his first book is Economic Point of View. It's a history of the meaning of the term economics among economist scientists. Then his follow-up book on that is a book in price theory called the market theory and the price system. And then on the heels of that, he wrote an essay on capital. So you can see, and then, so he's involved in technical economics, the intellectual history of economics, and that's it. He's trying to reconcile in his mind what he says happened to him, which was he was listening to Mises's lectures, and he was a doctoral student of Mises. He's listening to Mises lectures, and Mises says the market is not a place, the market is not a thing, the market is a process. And then at the same time, he's learning microeconomics from George Stigler, and he's recognizing that the way he's learning microeconomics is different from the way Mises, and he's trying to figure out a way that you can square those things. And that's been basically his career. How can a Misesian fill in the theoretical lacunas in the standard model that as its presentation? And so he's an economist. That's what he focuses on. Murray Rothbard was different. Rothbard was a social theorist. As a social theorist, he was an economist, but he also was a historian. He was a political ethics. He wrote things in ethics. And above all and everything, he was a political activist throughout his career. He was very much influenced in trying to influence the political actions of the day. And so as a result, he was always involved either with Republicans, to creating the libertarian movement, to trying to affect change by various different, political alliances. So anyone who's involved in politics knows that you can't win just being by yourself. So you end up by building alliances and coalitions with various different groups. And a lot of Rothbard's positions over the years, some of which are in fact controversial positions that that many of us would find repugnant, they are a result really not of anything in Rothbard's own doctrines, I would argue, but in his desire to have political coalitions to defeat on certain margins. So in the 1960s, when he was anti-Vietnam War, he was very much aligned with the New Left. In the 1990s, when he was concerned about increasing role of the state in order to control certain decisions that were being made, he aligned with the paleo-conservatives. So he always had different people that he coalesced with, and as a result of that, the track record of him has a varied and sort of not as clear-cut an example of just the scholarly contributions as Kerzner. With Rothbard, it's more nuanced, and you'd have to sort out a variety of things. That said, Rothbard made major contributions to understanding revisionist history, to the development of Austrian economics as a scientific discipline, he also was in many ways the inventor of modern libertarianism. He was such a powerful thinker, for example, that he had a huge impact on Robert Nozick. He's the reason why Robert Nozick started doing what he did. Nozick has been very clear about that over the years. A lot of this nuance is brought up in a new book by Yannick Wasserman, who's a historian at the University of Alabama. His book called Marginal Revolutionaries is a history of the Austrian school. And it just won the Best Book of the Year award by History of Economic Society. Marginal Revolutionaries is published by Yale. I don't agree with everything that's in Yannick's book. In fact, I disagree with certain serious parts of it, and part of it is things that I partook in, so I think he misunderstands some things, but he's very open, very knowledgeable scholar, and it's a very well-written book, so I would really recommend it to anyone who has a history of wanting to study this stuff. But he makes a very distinct charge about what happened with Austrian economics as it migrated from the European context to the United States context, and how it was leveraged for political reasons as opposed to just purely scholarly and scientific reasons. There's a lot of value in what he has to say about that. But let me just step back. The Austrians are embroiled in three major debates in the 20th century. So, and those are a methodological debate, and then two, maybe three very major analytical debates. So the first methodological debate is the debate over the epistemological status of economics and the role of formalism, abstract mathematical modeling, and empiricism, statistical testing, and also the notion of excessive aggregation. And the Austrians are the opposite of all three of those things. They make arguments against the excessive formalization, they make arguments against empiricism, and they make arguments against aggregation. Modern economics went in the opposite direction, right? So all you have to do is think about, Samuelson and Friedman as the text of the 20th century in the methodology of economics, despite the fact that the two of them clashed over the nature of realism in economics. But leave that aside for right now. You have Friedman representing the empiricist angle. It's all about testing. You have Samuelson representing the formalism, right? It's all about the validity of the models. And they both were working in models that were, because they were influenced by the Keynesian revolution, they worked in models that lacked a micro foundation. So they actually ended up by moving in a direction towards excessive aggregation. The Austrians in real time lost the debate, but over time, each of the different positions, the formalism, the empiricism, and the aggregation, came under renewed criticism later on, 25, 30, 40 years later, that would in fact resurrect many of the arguments that Hayek gave against these kind of ideas, or even that Mises gave against these ideas. So these are ongoing and contested battles. Analytically, the Austrians, because remember I said they were focused on this idea of the agent, the uncertainty of the future, their models are not single exit models. They're not, they don't deal with, functions as if they're smooth and continuous and twice differentiable. That's part of their criticism of the formalism. And so instead they wanted to focus on processes of adjustment and adaptation to change rather than end states. In modern language, they wanted to deal with what could be called wicked learning environments, not kind learning environments. I don't have enough time to go into depth on that, so just write those terms down and look them up. Wicked learning environments versus kind learning environments. Most economics tries to take a wicked environment and make it turn out to be a kind environment. The Austrians embrace the wickedness of the environment within which economic actors are engaged in learning through time. These analytical focuses ended up by concentrating the attention of the Austrians on business cycles and the issue of socialist economic calculation. The fact that they were focused on business cycles and socialist calculation meant that they ended up by engaging in the big clashes of the 20th century between Keynesian economics and the debate over market socialism. And so, first the debate with Marx's comprehensive socialism, and then the debate with market socialism. That is part of the economic calculation debate. And so the question, I think, that's really important to understand where the Austrian school is today is, what did these debates teach us? Right? So what did these debates teach us about the way that we do economics? And so I have a list here of some 9 things that we have: the extension of subjectivism from value and cost to expectations. We focus on methodological individualism. That is that in the debates in the social sciences between agency and structure, too much has been spent on either agency unmoored from structure or structure unconnected to agents. The Austrian school is about agencies and structure being blended to one another. And so they take a different position on that. Analytically, they focus on imperfect knowledge economics. This leads to market process analysis as well as institutional analysis. So the focus is always on those, as I said, property prices and profit and loss, but also the law and the political infrastructure and the social values and mores that form our society. They become part of what it is that we need to study to be able to understand exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. All right, and then finally on practical aspects, let me just say here, so the means ends analysis and dynamics of interventions, unintended consequences of intervention, but the main thing is the framework. So if I can just give you an example, you can ask Bobby Hertzberg when she talks about public choice about this as well. There's a, in the field of public choice and experimental economics, there's a thing called Plott's fundamental equation. Charlie Plott was a student of Jim Buchanan, and he summarized this position very easily. And this is how it is. You have an animating agent, and you have variation in the pattern of outcomes in any social situation. What I don't want to do is explain the variation in the outcomes by variation in the people that populate my model. It's not theoretical to say good people do good things, bad people do bad things. I don't need a theory to do that. So I'm going to have this animating agent, and the way I'm going to do this analytically is I'm going to treat preferences as fixed. So I'm going to treat preferences as fixed, not going to accept preference-based explanations. And then I'm going to explain the variation in the pattern of outcome by the variation of the institutions within which the individuals interact. So the different rules of the game and their enforcement that agents find themselves interacting in are going to be able to explain the variation in the outcome. All right, that's Plott's fundamental equation. That's what the Austrians have been arguing. That's what Buchanan argues when he says, you know, different players same players, different rules produce different outcomes. And so this is the sort of key insight to the framework, and why the necessity of the framework is the key thing. All right, so let's just step back for a second and think about the arc of the Austrian school in the 20th century. Because the intellectual context of the Austrian school is set in the background of these various different actions. I mentioned novels here, or memoirs that will and history that will enlighten, kind of, you know, give you a sense of the idea. So The World of Yesterday is a book by Stefan Zweig. It's about the decline of the Viennese culture. And this is the Fin de siècle Vienna, which is the height of civilization, to the decline of the Habsburg Empire and the descendancy into barbarism once Hitler, you know, takes over. Then you have, at the same time, you have the Fin de siècle Vienna and all of this happening on. You also have the war, you know, the entering in of World War I and all quiet on the Western Front, and the notion of what the horrors of this war were all about. Right on the heels of that, you get the Great Depression. So the deprivation of the Great Depression. And then you have the threat to civilization itself in the Nazi threat and the rise of the Third Reich and Hitler. And then finally, you have the Cold War and the inhumanity of socialism revealed, and that's like in the Gulag Archipelago. It's against that arc of history that Hayek, for example, is writing throughout this period of time. So I think as one of the readings that I gave you was my recent book on Hayek, a PDF on that book. And you'll see I try to tell this story about the arc of Hayek's career and the intellectual context and historical context against which he was writing. And I think that explains a lot. The question we have to ask now is, for given, you know, these ideas, now this context, what is the context, the arc that we see going on in the 21st century? And it's an unending quest to understand the human condition, but we have to understand that human condition within the world as we see it, you know, today. So my own personal ideas of where I see the interaction effect between the Austrian school, or the modern Austrian school, or what I call the contemporary Austrian school, leave the modern to the Kirzner Rothbard generation, but contemporary Austrian school, is that we are engaged in development economics. We're still trying to explain why some nations are rich and other nations are poor, why nations that were poor became rich, and how rich nations can in fact become poor. And so not only the work of Easterly, but also the work of Acemoglu These are wedge opportunities for people to jump into and be involved in. The innovation economy, so not only the legacy of the work of Bill Baumol on innovation and the free market innovation machine, as Baumol refers to it, but also Paul Romer and the notion of creativity within markets and how we understand the nature of creativity in markets. Obviously, the financial fault lines that have been drawn, that we notice from the global financial crisis. But, it's not merely the Minsky moment. It's not the rise of Minsky as much as it's better understood by, Raghu Rajan, who, who's a professor at Chicago, was the head of the Indian Central Bank, was a lead economist at the IMF. There's wedge opportunities for the interactions of the Austrians with Rajan. All these authors recognize these aspects of these different connections to either greater or lesser extent, but also then, how we marshal those in. And so, and they're great opportunities. And then finally, just the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice from Adam Smith all the way up to Deirdre McCloskey's most recent book on why liberalism works. And so, that's this notion of social cooperation, or the ability, what institutions hinder or promote the ability of individuals to realize productive specialization and engage in peaceful social cooperation with disparate others that are often at great social distance. That's the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice that Adam Smith lays out, and it's also the one that McCloskey and others are trying to develop. So my final note about this, and I understand I'm kind of running through this in a quick and ready way, and probably pushing up already against the time if I already haven't exceeded it, which is that I want to stress that the Austrian school stands in distinction from other schools of economics while being committed to the technical principles of economics. The Austrians always put the individuals with their foibles and their fears at the center. We do rational choice economics as if it is done by humans, and we do institutional analysis as if history matters. And as a consequence of that, our understanding of the spontaneous forces of the market, of human action, but not of human design, take on a different way in which we articulate that basic insight of the invisible hand from our fellow economists who try to rely on general competitive equilibrium models, or what I could say maximizing an equilibrium. So if it's maximization and equilibrium, which is the standard way in which economists are trained to think of these things, the Austrians are asking a different question. That is, it's not so much the behavioral characteristics of the individual, their cognitive capacities that are necessary for markets to function. It's the institutional environment and the learning mechanisms that we want to focus our attention on. It's the social epistemology of the institutions that are important, or what I call in my Hayek book, epistemic institutionalism, as opposed to just purely incentive institutionalism. Not denying the importance of incentives, but it's really this learning mechanism that's the crucial idea of the Austrians. And like with liberalism in general, the Austrian school has always taken it that the purpose of the institutional arrangements are to be so arranged that you lift up the least advantaged in society. That's the concern. Modern economic growth is this amazing miracle, right? It's the hockey stick. And what's the consequence of that hockey stick on modern economic growth, or on human lives, is it allows us to live longer, better, more flourishing lives than when we were subject to this. Liberalism is born as an emancipation project. It was emancipation from the the subjugation by the crown. That's why you have the Magna Carta, to try to put limits on the crown. You have, it's against the dogma of the church. That's why you get the religious toleration, the long struggle for religious toleration. It is a struggle against the violence of the sword. So we try to constrain the military, so the military and doesn't, just run roughshod over us. We have various restrictions on those things, rules of engagement. And then finally, it is a emancipation from the misery of poverty. And so we want to overcome both the tying to the plow, as well as being governed by the mercantilist interest. Adam Smith's book is a criticism of the mercantilist interest, not a defender of the mercantilist interest, right? So liberalism has always been this emancipation project. And the key thing about understanding economics is that it co-evolved with the development and refinement of these institutions of liberal governance. All right, so liberalism in governance rises up, and economic science of studying the market mechanism, since it always exists inside or embedded in these relationships, it's going to in fact co-evolve. And that idea needs to be stressed and continued to this day. And so, as I've been saying lately, and maybe some of you can question this or challenge it, be good to have this conversation and learn. But my view is that liberalism represents, in a metaphor sense, a hand across languages, across nations, across religions, across ethnicities, a hand across to welcome strangers into a friendly relation of mutually beneficial exchange. And the mechanism of those mutually beneficial exchanges creates economic wealth. And that economic wealth represents a hand down to help up the least advantaged to be lifted up. So liberalism is both a hand across and a hand down to be able to help people lift up, not to ever push someone down and not to ever push someone away. So free trade, free migration, open borders, all of those things are part and parcel of what it means to have a liberal regime. Kant described this best in the phrase, strangers nowhere in this world. That is the cosmopolitan liberal vision. And that actually is the vision that the modern Austrian school represents. And so what we have to recognize is, while there is, yes, indeed, a science of economics, go all the way back to my second slide, there's these detailed scientific propositions in economics. But there also is the art of political economy. And the Austrian school, the contemporary Austrian school of economics, is continuing to contribute both to the science of economics and to the art of political economy. And that is humanitarian. So we're humanistic in our method and humanitarian in our concern.
What is the debate? Are non-Austrians saying that human individual agency doesn't matter?
Does non-Austrian say that individually? So no, it's in many ways they either say that it doesn't matter or that it's all that matters. And so the question is the play between agency and structure and all of these ideas. Now, there was a question put to me in the list that I saw on Bayesian updating. That's one way to understand individual learning. It's been a very effective way in which people have tried to do that. The person who's asking me that must be familiar with modeling exercises. So I would really recommend to them a paper by Larry Samuelson in the Journal of Economic Literature on knowledge assumptions within economics. It's a very, very valuable overview of all this. I think that the Austrians would simply say that the Bayesian learning model is a too mechanical of a version of the way in which individuals learn. So one way to get at this is a more nuanced understanding of the application of Bayes' model. And that would be in Roman Friedman's work with Michael Goldberg, but also with Ned Phelps. And they wrote a book, Goldberg and Friedman have a book called Imperfect Knowledge Economics. But Friedman, Goldberg, and Phelps developed a model of what they call theory consistent expectations. So the way in which a standard application of Bayes' law to decision making within economics was in the new classical model of rational expectations. And the way to think about that is that you have one true model of the world. You have a prior. On the basis of that prior, you make a decision. You're confronted with a refractory reality, and then you adopt and change your behavior, and that's how you learn. And so you would dovetail rather relatively quickly to a rational expectations equilibrium. And what Friedman, and so that's like the Lucas model and everything. And that's actually what drives a lot of Brian Kaplan's understanding about search processes. If you read, you know, my colleague Brian Kaplan or whatever, it was a fairly standard modeling procedure for many years. And behavioral economics is built on the grounds that because of cognitive biases, you can't update like that, right? So this is part of the issue. What Friedman and Goldberg did was slightly different, and what they argued was that we form our what they call theory consistent expectations. And so if I have a theory about the way the world works, that forms my prior. When I confront the refractory reality, what I do is I update to fit into my theory, right? So I don't update to fit into the one true model of the world because there's multiple models of the world. And so Keynesians will update by looking at the data of the world and seeing it be like Keynesians would see it. And rational expectations or monetarist types see the data and they update like a monetarist would, right? And so that's why you get these sort of inability to dovetail to a rational expectations equilibrium kind of idea. Anyway, that was a question that was put to me about learning. And I think that learning models are in fact what we're trying to do. Bayes' learning model is one, the Bayes formula is one way we have learning models, but there's other ways. And I would also recommend a new book by Mario Rizzo and Glenn Whitman called Escaping Paternalism, which is published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. But I want to use one example which is relevant to today. I understand the time, but it's relevant to think about this, is that COVID-19 is hit. All right, now many of us have formed all kinds of expectations about that. Part of which is that a lot of information flows have come in. Remember that the phrase was facts, not fear, right? But part of in order to make us have compliance, right, with various different decisions, there's actually been, you know, a lot of shifting information, part of which is to try to tell you about the bad news side of things, not the good news side. So we've been inundated for 3 months with bad news. Now we're going to open up the economy, and we are faced with a coordination game, basically. Restaurants would like to open up. Let's say that the governor, like in Virginia, gives them, we go into phase 3, so you have 75% capacity, or let's say we go to phase 100% capacity, right? So the restaurants would like to open up, and no one wants a restaurant because they're fearful of what might happen to them when they go to the restaurant. On the other hand, you know, I would like to go to a restaurant. Maybe I'm more risk taking, and I'm willing to go to the restaurant, but none of the restaurants will open up. Right? And so what happens, you have this real coordination problem. This is a coordination failure that was identified by the economists Robert Clower and Axel Leyenhofen a long time ago. This kind of coordination problem that I'm describing. And that requires someone to break that coordination. Well, that requires that we update our expectations about the fear levels that we have. So what would be the kind of signal that would tell us? So is that going to be something like a treatment option? Is that going to be and by the way, we've seen this happen before. You know, you guys are all young, so you don't remember this, but imagine you're a college student in the late 1970s and you start hearing about this disease called HIV or AIDS. and you're deciding how to actually make sensible sexual decisions. And you're involved in that. The very same Dr. Fauci in 1984, from his same position of power, issued a report that said you could get HIV from toilet seats. And therefore you needed to watch, what you're doing when you go to normal bathrooms and things like that. It's hard for kids today to pay attention to this, but like Karl Malone didn't want to play a basketball game with Magic Johnson. When Magic Johnson first came out, he didn't want to play with him because he was afraid that he was going to catch the disease from playing basketball with him, right? And he said that, out loud. And so we had to learn, and we had to adjust and adapt our behavior so that we could actually manage reasonable risk mitigation. That's a function of our learning and our expectations. And that's what we're trying to get at in these learning models. How is it that we overcome that? A very mechanical version is gonna not get that. But a model that assumes that we never learn at all isn't gonna get anything either. So how do we get the right amount of information? Remember, going back to Erwin Decker's title, Austrian economists are not trying to predict and control. Austrian economists are trying to understand, and they're trying to get meanings and understanding. So it's a different science. Sorry.
Okay. Great. Can you speak to the political outlooks of the Austrians relative to some other dominant views?
Yeah, that's been one of because the Austrians put an emphasis on the institutional infrastructure and the role that private property plays in incentivizing individuals, the role that the free flow of prices play in informing individual actors, and the role that profits and losses play in luring us and disciplining us so we have innovation. The Austrians have tended to focus on those liberal institutions of property, contract, and consent, right? So you go back to Hume's property, contract, and consent. The Austrians are a modern version of defending that proposition. But within the Austrian camp, you have a variety of different positions, from very traditional classical liberals to radical, anarchists, right? So just think about in the modern times, you have Ed Stringham's book, Private Governance, right? Which is about how it is that you can see, that's published by Oxford University Press, right? So it's not just in extreme examples like, Scarbeck's book on prisoners, where you're looking at prisons and how it is that they self-regulate, or you're looking at Leeson's book on pirates and how they self-regulate it. What Stringham is doing in his book is looking at how in modern capitalist developed societies, people develop private governance mechanisms. And his argument, like Benson's argument, like Robert Nelson's argument on private neighborhoods, is that those private mechanisms outperform public governance mechanisms, right? On the other hand, I just published a book in 2019. It's called Public Governance and the Classical Liberal Perspective. And that book is more about how do we organize the public sector to be able to provide the governance that is necessary for people to realize cooperation and productive specialization and social cooperation. And so, this again is a situation where if you just use a sort of a standard, a model, it's a model is a depiction, not a real model, but a depiction in which you have characterizations of countries which are strong and weak states, or, like functioning or failed states, strong or weak states, and you have governments that are also either limited in their powers or unlimited in their powers. The classical liberal position doesn't want a weak state, right, that is unlimited, or a weak state that is limited, right? The classical liberal governance things wants like a limited state that is actually strong so that it actually can be effective in carrying out its goals. And so that's what Tyler Cowen calls state capacity libertarianism kind of idea. I think Tyler and others maybe overstate that position because we always have to worry about predation. So in addition to the book that I have a bunch of papers out over the last several years on the issue of you have a protective state, you have a productive state, and then you have your predatory state. And the question is how is it that you empower the protective and the productive without unleashing the predatory? And that is the classic puzzle that goes all the way back to, antiquity and, trying to figure out how, Gilgamesh, was able to, control it. How did they control Gilgamesh? Well, they had to create Enoch as a countervailing force to be able to do it. That's an age-old constitutional puzzle. And the Austrians are just modern social scientists that are embedded in that long conversation. And so the various different positions of whether or not, and I'll end this aspect with this. I think it turns in many ways on tacit presuppositions that people have. So are you, in your own experience and in your own learning, are you optimistic about public mechanisms disciplining public predation? Are you pessimistic about private institutions disciplining private predation? So to many Austrians, not all, right, but to many, they're going to be optimistic about private mechanisms disciplining private predation and pessimistic about public institutions curtailing public predation. If in our effort to take care of private predation, we create a public entity, but that public entity can predate at even a greater percentage than the private entity, come on now, right? But the people that tend to be more public governance oriented, they tend to be more pessimistic about private mechanisms of disciplining and more optimistic about constitutions and things like that, whereas the others are the opposite side. So I think there's all kinds of permutations, and there's no one set Austrian view. The one thing I will say is that the phraseology Austro-libertarianism should never be uttered. Austrian economics is not the same as libertarianism. Some Austrians can be libertarians, other Austrians are not libertarians. And by trying to insist that all Austrians are in this one box, you mischaracterize the history of the tradition, and you mischaracterize the richness of why it is that some people end up by being both an Austrian economist and having libertarian sensibilities. So I myself I've never met a libertarian more libertarian than me. So it's not like I'm defending or one in defending, big state or whatever like that. But I think I can bifurcate my economics from my moral philosophy.
Great. These are great responses. We actually have time for just one more question. It's a short Q&A period. So
I'm really sorry about that.
It's great. Can you say a little bit more about where you see Austrian economics fitting into the broader discipline of economics and how that relates to your concept of mainline economics?
So I have a bunch of this stuff written down that I saw some of these questions. I wanted to respond, and I apologize for not getting through that many because I'm long-winded. My view is that Austrian economics is the most consistent and persistent practitioners of the mainline tradition of economics. But mainline tradition of economics is really Smithian political economy. So it's in some sense you're not going to be able to see this I don't have a picture, but imagine an hourglass. And in the late 19th century, the hourglass is at the top, so it's wide, okay? And, the question at the end of the 19th century was Max Weber's question. Why no capitalism in China? This is a question that fascinates social scientists. If I was a Martian and I came to Earth in 1200, China would have been the most advanced civilization on Earth. If I was a Martian and I came to the Earth in 1400, it would have been the Islamic Crescent. Why all of a sudden did this backward, Western Europe, Northern Western Europe, all of a sudden end up by being this, pinnacle of economic growth and development? And why did that not happen in other places? So that question was a big, hairy question at the end of the 19th century. The 20th century by 1950 becomes narrower and narrower. So the hourglass gets really, really tiny. All right. And that's when economics is more and more precise, but less and less relevant. It becomes more precise, but less and less relevant. Well, once we got there, then we realized we couldn't answer the questions that we wanted to answer. So the solo growth model is the classic of this, because it's trying to exhaust the reasons why we had economic growth. And it's trying to explain the reasons in total factor productivity. And at the end of the day, what Solow says is a negative result, because he argues that the existing discussions of capital intensivity or of labor don't explain it. So it's in the residual. It's all in that error term, in the residual, meaning that as you know, this is now bastardizing Wittgenstein, but that which is most important we must remain silent on. That's what economists were stuck with in the mid of the century. So what happened was, all of a sudden economics started opening up. It started opening up to law and economics. It started opening up to studying politics. It started opening up to studying religion. It started studying this, and you get the big development question. So you end the 20th century, right? And begin the 21st century with the biggest book in economics being Acemoglu and Robinson's book, Why Nations Fail, Why Some Nations Are Rich, Other Nations Are Poor. We're back all the way back to Max Weber's question again. And so the economics has opened up. When it opened up like that, that brought back all that Smithian political economy into the agenda. And so the Smithian political economy that the Austrians are the most consistent and persistent appliers of is now back on the agenda, though not everyone's recognizing that. So it's up to the people that practice it to make sure that the people who are now trying to ask these big questions again pay attention to it, right? So I was very fortunate on the most recent Acemoglu Robinson book. I was at the conference at Northwestern to represent, and I was actually given the opportunity to be the first person to comment on the book in front of everyone and write out my comments. And I'm, thanked in the acknowledgments and everything, but then, the book doesn't exactly fully reflect, what I had to say. So then I wrote these papers on predation and stuff, to try to do it. And so we all are trying to raise our hand in the classroom of the professional opinion and do that. But there's some really fascinating development. So, the whole Arizona school and people like Jerry Gauss and David Schmitz and their students, they're doing Smithian political economy in some broad sense, right? So they're doing philosophy and they're in philosophy, but they're really in the moral sciences. And so that's Smithian political economy. At the same time, you have, now David Skarbek, for example, at Brown. And so that's in political science as well. You got different people in law schools. They're not just in economics departments, right? And yet they're still doing economics or economically informed. And so we that are economists need to push for this. I think the whole PPE movement is, again, another great opportunity for us to see this idea. And if I can test your patience, Jim Buchanan, who was my teacher, besides Don Lavoie, and Jim Buchanan wrote an essay in 1979 called On Hayek. And I think everyone should read it that's in economics or whatever. And the reason is because he argues that now keep in mind the time frame, 1979, and remember my hourglass and what's going on. And what Buchanan argues is that property rights economics, law and economics, public choice economics, and market process economics need to be married and not a source of contestation, but they need to be amalgamated into a single paradigm to represent the next challenge to the Samuelsonian edifice, right? And so we've seen this in new institutional economics. We've seen it in, new political economy kind of ideas. And so there's a lot of really exciting opportunities, and the Austrians need to be part of those developments, because I'm like with Buchanan in the sense that it's the market process stuff that's actually the glue that holds all these things together. Not everyone sees it that way, obviously, but I think that that's what I mean by mainline economics.